She's been holding her father's hand through his nightmares for years. But when her son whispers, "I had them too," everything she thought she knew about her family is shattered, and she's forced to face the dark truth about the pain they're all hiding. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Clara's alarm chirped at 5 a.m., pulling her from a restless sleep. She blinked at the ceiling, taking just a moment to gather her strength before swinging her feet onto the cold hardwood floor. The house was quiet, but she knew better than to expect it would stay that way for long. As if on cue, she heard shuffling from her father's room down the hall. Clara pulled on her robe and made her way toward the sound, her shoulders already tensing. The morning light hadn't yet broken through the windows, but she could make out George's silhouette moving erratically around his room. "Dad?" she called softly, not wanting to startle him. "Everything okay?" George turned, squinting in her direction. His silver hair stuck up at odd angles, and his hands patted various surfaces: the dresser, the nightstand, his pockets. "Can't find my glasses," he muttered. "Need my glasses." Clara spotted them right away, perched on top of his head. With gentle hands, she reached up and brought them down to his face. "Here they are, Dad. Right where you left them." His face reddened slightly. Knew they had to be somewhere. He adjusted them on his nose, but his movements remained agitated, uncertain. "Let's get you dressed for the day," Clara suggested, already moving toward his closet. She needed to keep them on schedule. Ben would be up soon, and her shift at the hospital started at 7. George grumbled, but allowed her to help him select clothes, a comfortable flannel shirt and khaki pants. As she laid them out on the bed, he said, "I can dress myself, Clara. Been doing it for 70 years. "I know, Dad." She smiled, though. Exhaustion pulled at the corners of her mouth. Just trying to help speed things up a bit. She left him to dress and hurried to Ben's room. Her 10-year-old son was still sound asleep, curled up under his superhero blanket. Clara hated to wake him, but there was no choice. "Time to get up, sweetheart," she said, running a hand through his dark hair. Ben stirred, his eyes opening slowly. "Already? 'Fraid so. Big day at school today, remember? You have that science presentation." That seemed to wake him up a bit more. He sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Will you help me practice one more time?" Clara glanced at her watch. They were already running behind. "Let's practice while you eat breakfast, okay?" In the kitchen, Clara moved with practiced efficiency, starting coffee, toasting bread, scrambling eggs. Her hands performed these tasks automatically, while her mind raced ahead to her upcoming shift. Mrs. Rodriguez would need her medication adjusted, and Mr. Thompson was scheduled for discharge. A crash from the bathroom made her jump. "Dad?" she called out, already moving in that direction. "You okay?" "Fine." George's voice came back sharp, defensive. "Just knocked over the thing." The soap thing. Clara found him standing amid scattered toiletries, looking lost in his own bathroom. The soap dispenser lay in pieces at his feet. His shirt was buttoned wrong, and his hands trembled slightly as he tried to right the mess. "Here, let me help," Clara said, bending to pick up the broken pieces. "I said I'm fine," George snapped, then immediately looked ashamed. I can handle it, Clara." She straightened his buttons quietly, pretending not to notice the way he avoided her eyes. "I know you can, Dad. But it's okay to let me help sometimes." Back in the kitchen, Ben sat at the table in his school clothes, poking at his eggs while reading from note cards. Clara served George his breakfast, toast with jam, the way he liked it, and finally poured herself a cup of coffee. The morning rush continued its familiar chaos. Clara packed Ben's lunch while helping him remember the stages of photosynthesis. She made sure George took his medications, all while trying to get herself ready for work. Her scrubs felt like armor as she pulled them on, preparing for another long day of caring for others. The drive to Ben's school was quiet, both of them tired from the early start. As he climbed out of the car, Clara called, "You'll do great on your presentation, honey. I love you." "Love you too, Mom," Ben mumbled, already walking toward his friends. The hospital was busy, as always. Clara threw herself into her work, checking vitals, administering medications, comforting worried family members. Hours blurred together in a parade of needs to be met, problems to be solved. By the time her shift ended, her feet ached and her back screamed for relief. Mrs. Peterson, one of her favorite patients, noticed her fatigue. "You look worn out, dear," she said as Clara checked her IV. "Who takes care of you while you're taking care of everyone else?" Clara managed a smile. "I'm fine. Just a long day." But as she drove home that night, the question echoed in her mind. The house was dark when she arrived, well past 9. Ben would be in bed, hopefully asleep. She expected to find George in his usual spot in front of the TV, but the living room was empty. Then she heard it, the muffled sounds of distress coming from his bedroom. Clara's exhaustion fell away as she hurried down the hall. George was thrashing in his bed, caught in the grip of another nightmare. "No, no, get down," he muttered, his face contorted in anguish. "They're coming. Get down. Dad." Clara called softly, approaching with careful steps. "Dad, it's okay. You're home. You're safe." George's eyes flew open, wild and unseeing at first. Clara reached for his hand, holding it firmly. "It's just me, Dad. It's Clara. You're home in bed. Everything's okay." Slowly, recognition dawned in his eyes. His breathing steadied, but his hand clutched hers like a lifeline. "Clara?" His voice sounded small, confused, so different from his usual gruff tone. "I'm here." She sat on the edge of his bed, still holding his hand. "Another bad dream?" He nodded, looking away. "They're getting worse again. I see their faces, hear the explosions." His voice cracked, and he fell silent. Clara felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them away. She couldn't break down. Not when they needed her to be strong. Her father's hand trembled in hers, and she could feel the weight of his unspoken trauma, the memories that haunted him night after night. The exhaustion of the day pressed down on her shoulders like a physical thing. Her mind drifted to all the tasks, still waiting. Lunches to pack for tomorrow. Bills to pay. Medications to sort. But for now, she simply sat in the darkness with her father, holding his hand, being the anchor he needed. "Try to get some rest," she whispered, though she knew sleep would be elusive for both of them tonight. Her own bed called to her, but she stayed a few minutes longer, watching as George's breathing evened out, his grip on her hand gradually loosening. When she finally stood, her legs felt heavy, her whole body weighed down by the endless responsibilities. But she straightened her shoulders and took a deep breath. Tomorrow would bring another early morning, another day of caring for others. She had to keep going, had to stay strong, for her father, for Ben, for all the patients who needed her. Even if she wasn't sure how much longer she could carry it all. Morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Clara stood at the stove, stirring oatmeal, while keeping one eye on her father. George sat at the small kitchen table, staring blankly at the newspaper in front of him. He hadn't turned a page in 15 minutes. "Dad?" Clara placed a steaming bowl in front of him. "I added honey, just the way you like it." George didn't respond. His weathered hands rested on the table, completely still. His blue eyes, usually sharp despite his age, seemed clouded with memories she couldn't reach. "Dad, please eat something." Clara touched his shoulder gently. "You need your strength." He blinked slowly, as if swimming up from deep water. "What?" "Oh." He looked down at the bowl as if surprised to find it there. "Not hungry. Just a few bites?" Clara pressed, trying to keep the worry from her voice. She watched as he picked up the spoon, then set it down again without taking a bite. Ben wandered into the kitchen, already dressed for school in his favorite red t-shirt. "Morning, Mom." "Morning, Grandpa." He slid into his chair, immediately reaching for the cereal box. George didn't acknowledge his grandson's presence, something that hadn't gone unnoticed by Clara. Her father's withdrawal had been getting worse over the past few weeks. The moments of confusion were more frequent, the silent spells longer. As she packed Ben's lunch, Clara's mind wandered to the pamphlet she'd seen at the hospital. "Support Services for Veterans and Their Families," it had read. The therapist's number was still stored in her phone, undialed. Every time she thought about making the call, something held her back. I can handle this, she whispered to herself, packing an apple into Ben's lunchbox with more force than necessary. We've managed this long. But had they? The morning routine felt like walking through quicksand, every step a struggle, every moment threatening to pull them under. George hadn't touched his oatmeal, and his vacant stare had returned. Clara's chest tightened with familiar anxiety. She glanced at her phone on the counter. One call could start them on a path to help. The therapist specialized in veterans with PTSD. But making that call felt like admitting defeat, like saying she wasn't enough for her family. Mom, Ben's voice, pulled her from her thoughts. Can you sign my permission slip? It's for the field trip next week. Of course, honey. Clara signed the paper, grateful for the normal moment amid the morning's tension. As she scribbled her name, she noticed her hand trembling slightly. George suddenly pushed back from the table, his chair scraping against the floor. Going to my room, he announced, leaving his untouched breakfast behind. Clara watched him shuffle away, his shoulders hunched, as if carrying an invisible weight. She should follow him, try again to get him to eat, but exhaustion crept through her bones. Instead, she sat heavily in the chair he'd vacated. He's just having a rough morning, sweetie. Clara forced a smile. Some days are harder than others. The day passed in a blur of patients and paperwork at the hospital. Clara moved through her nursing duties on autopilot, her mind constantly drifting back home. During her lunch break, she pulled out her phone and stared at the therapist's number again. Her finger hovered over the screen before she quickly put it away. Evening brought its own challenges. George barely touched his dinner, and Clara had to coax him to take his medication. By the time she got to Ben's bedroom for their nightly routine, she felt drained of every ounce of energy. Did you brush your teeth? She asked, pulling his covers up to his chin. Ben nodded, then hesitated. Mom? Yes, honey? I've been having bad dreams. His voice was small in the dim room. About scary things. Clara's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her voice steady. Everyone has bad dreams sometimes. They're not real. You know that, right? I guess, Ben fidgeted with his blanket. But they feel real when I'm having them. Do you want to tell me about them? Clara asked, though part of her dreaded the answer. One more problem to solve, one more worry to carry. Ben shook his head. Not really. I just wanted you to know. Okay, sweetie. Clara leaned down and kissed his forehead, breathing in the clean scent of his shampoo. Try to think happy thoughts before you go to sleep. That usually helps. As she turned off his light and closed his door, Clara felt the weight of the day pressing down on her shoulders. She'd brushed off Ben's admission too quickly, she knew that. But acknowledging his nightmares meant facing another crack in the facade of normalcy she worked so hard to maintain. Standing in the hallway between her son's room and her father's, Clara felt torn between two generations needing her help. She was doing her best to hold everything together, but doubt gnawed at the edges of her confidence. Was her best really enough? The sound of George muttering in his sleep drifted from his room, and Clara closed her eyes. She should check on him, but her feet wouldn't move. Just for a moment, she leaned against the wall, letting it support her weight, as she hadn't allowed herself to be supported in so long. The therapist's card was still in her purse, the number undialed. Maybe tomorrow, she thought. Maybe tomorrow she'd be strong enough to admit she needed help. But for now, she straightened her shoulders and headed toward her father's room, ready to face whatever the night might bring. Clara sat in the sterile examination room beside her father, watching as Dr. Martinez reviewed George's chart. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across her father's face, making him appear older than his 72 years. George's hands were clasped tightly in his lap, his jaw set in that familiar stubborn line. Mr. Bennett, Dr. Martinez began, his voice gentle but firm. Your blood pressure is higher than I'd like to see. And these night terrors you've been experiencing, they're getting more frequent? George stared at a point on the wall. I sleep fine. Clara cleared her throat. Dad, that's not true. You were up 3 times last night alone. The PTSD. Symptoms seem to be intensifying, Dr. Martinez continued, directing his words to both of them. The combination of anxiety, sleep disturbance, and these episodes of confusion, they're taking a toll on your overall health. Clara's stomach tightened. She'd noticed the changes herself, the way her father would get lost in his memories, how he'd sometimes forget what day it was, the increasing frequency of his nightmares. But hearing it confirmed by a medical professional made it feel more real, more urgent. "There are several treatment options we should consider," Dr. Martinez said, pulling out a prescription pad. "I'd like to adjust your current medication, and I strongly recommend starting cognitive behavioral therapy. There's a specialist who works specifically with veterans." "No." George's voice was firm. "No more doctors. No more pills. Dad, please." "I said no, Clara." His tone left no room for argument. Dr. Martinez looked at Clara sympathetically. "Miss Bennett, could I speak with you privately for a moment?" In the hallway, away from George's ears, Dr. Martinez's expression grew serious. "Your father's condition is deteriorating faster than we'd like. Without intervention, these symptoms will likely continue to worsen." Clara nodded, feeling the familiar weight settle more heavily on her shoulders. "I understand. But I can't force him to accept help." "No, you can't," Dr. Martinez agreed. "But you need to understand that caring for someone with severe PTSD can be extremely challenging. Are you getting any support yourself?" Clara forced a smile. "I'm fine. I'm a nurse. I know how to handle medical situations." "Being a medical professional doesn't make you immune to caregiver burnout," he said kindly. "There are support groups for family members of veterans. I can give you some information." "Thank you, but I've got it under control." Clara's voice was firm, even as she felt anything but in control. "I should get back to my father." The drive home was silent. George stared out the window, his expression distant. Clara's mind raced with worried thoughts, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. She had to make this work. She had to find a way to help him, even if he wouldn't help himself. At home, Clara waited until Ben was doing his homework upstairs before approaching her father in the living room. George sat in his favorite armchair, pretending to read a book, though she noticed his eyes weren't moving across the pages. "Dad?" She sat on the edge of the couch. "Can we talk about what Dr. Martinez said?" George's jaw tightened. "Nothing to talk about. There is, though." Clara leaned forward, trying to catch his eye. "The nightmares are getting worse. You're having more trouble sleeping. More moments where you seem lost. The therapy could help. I don't need help." George snapped, his voice sharp enough to make Clara flinch. "I've dealt with this for 50 years. I don't need some doctor picking through my brain." "But that's just it, Dad. You shouldn't have to deal with it alone anymore. There are people who understand what you're going through, other veterans." "You think they understand?" George's voice was low, dangerous. "Nobody understands. Nobody can understand unless they were there. Unless they saw." He cut himself off abruptly, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. Clara felt the familiar sense of helplessness washing over her. "Then help me understand. Talk to me, Dad. Please." "No." George turned away, effectively ending the conversation. "I'm tired. I think I'll go to bed early." Clara watched him shuffle down the hallway to his room, her heart heavy. She wanted to follow him, to try again, but she knew it would only lead to more resistance, more walls. A quiet sound from the stairway caught her attention. Ben sat on the steps, homework forgotten in his lap, watching her with worried eyes. Clara hadn't even heard him come down. "Hey, sweetie," she said, trying to inject cheerfulness into her voice. "How's the math coming along?" Ben shrugged, unusually quiet. He'd been like this more often lately, she realized with a start. Where was her chatty boy who used to tell her every detail about his day? When had he started carrying this weight in his young shoulders? "It's okay if you don't finish it all tonight," she said, patting the couch beside her. "Why don't you come sit with me for a bit?" But Ben just shook his head. "I should finish my homework," he mumbled, turning and heading back upstairs. Clara watched him go, her throat tight with unshed tears. She was failing them both, her father, trapped in his memories and refusing help, her son, withdrawing more each day. But what could she do? How could she fix any of this when she could barely keep herself together? She sat alone in the dimming living room, listening to the quiet sounds of the house, Ben's occasional footsteps above, the soft click of George's door closing completely, the steady tick of the clock on the wall. marking another day she hadn't found the answers she so desperately needed. Clara's shoes squeaked against the hospital's freshly mopped floors as she hurried down the corridor. The antiseptic smell and monitor beeping had become more comforting than home lately. "Mrs. Chen's refusing her morning meds again," Sarah called out. Clara nodded, changing direction. Mrs. Chen sat in bed, arms crossed. "No more pills," she declared. "Good morning, Mrs. Chen." Clara pulled up a chair. "Those pills help your heart. Don't you want to go home to your grandchildren?" Mrs. Chen's face softened. "They visit me here. Wouldn't it be nice to play in your garden again?" After hesitation, Mrs. Chen uncrossed her arms. "You're sneaky, Nurse Clara." Clara handed her the pills, watching her take the medication. Small victories. After lunch, Sarah announced, "New admission in 204. Male, mid-30s, severe abdominal pain, suspected appendicitis, but he's refusing treatment. Can't afford it." Clara found James Walker curled up in pain. "I'm Clara, your nurse." "Can't stay," he growled. "Bill's gonna kill me faster than this." Clara pulled up a chair. "If this is appendicitis and ruptures, you could die. Let's focus on keeping you alive, then discuss payment plans." For 20 minutes, Clara explained his options. Slowly, his defenses crumbled. "Okay," he whispered. "I'll stay." 2 hours later, Clara watched James being wheeled into surgery. They'd caught it just in time. This was why she'd become a nurse. But as her shift ended, reality crept back. 3 missed calls from Ben's school. A text about George pacing the yard. Home was too quiet. George sat at the kitchen table, staring at untouched dinner. "Dad, have you eaten?" George looked up slowly. "Not hungry." "Where's Ben?" "His room. Homework." George picked up his fork, set it down. "Clara, remember Tommy Martinez?" Clara's heart sank. "Yes, Dad. Good kid, Tommy. Should have been me that day." George's eyes went wide, breathing rapid. "Get down." "They're coming!" "Dad, you're safe," Clara said firmly. "You're home with me." But George wasn't seeing the kitchen. "Tommy, get down!" "Tommy." Clara moved slowly around the table. "Listen to my voice. You're home. You're safe." She touched his shoulder. George trembled, tears streaming. "I couldn't save him." Clara held his hand, fighting her own tears. The flashbacks were getting worse. Her medical training helped with physical wounds, but this ran deeper than anything she could bandage. George's breathing gradually steadied, but his eyes remained haunted. Tomorrow, he'd pretend it never happened. Watching her father's shoulders slump with exhaustion, Clara realized they couldn't continue like this. His trauma was crushing them both, and she lacked the tools to help. Chapter 5. The First Nightmare. Chapter 4. A Moment of Peace. Scene 2. The evening sky had already darkened when Clara's old sedan pulled into the driveway. Her shoulders ached from a long day of lifting patients and rushing between hospital rooms. All she wanted was a quiet dinner and maybe a few moments to herself before bed. But as she turned her key in the front door lock, a heart-wrenching scream pierced the silence. "Johnson, get down! They're coming from the trees!" Clara's exhaustion vanished instantly. She burst through the door, her nurse's instincts taking over as she rushed toward her father's bedroom. The hallway light cast long shadows on the walls, and there, frozen in the doorway, stood Ben in his Superman pajamas, his small frame rigid with fear. "Sweetie, go to your room," Clara said, trying to keep her voice steady as she gently guided him away from the door. "But Grandpa," Ben's voice quivered, "I'll take care of him." "Please, honey, go to your room." George's cries grew more desperate. "Don't leave them behind. We can't leave them behind." Clara hurried into her father's bedroom. George thrashed in his bed, tangled in sweat-soaked sheets. His face contorted in anguish as he fought invisible enemies in his mind. These episodes had become more frequent lately, but tonight seemed different, more intense. "Dad," Clara called out softly, keeping her distance. She'd learned the hard way not to get too close during these episodes. "Dad, you're safe. You're home. They're in the trees. Watch out." George's arms flailed, defending against unseen threats. Clara inched closer, her heart breaking at the sight of her strong father reduced to this state of terror. "Dad, it's Clara. You're having a nightmare. You're in your bedroom. In my house." George's eyes flew open, but they were distant, seeing something far away and terrible. "Johnson, Martinez. I couldn't save them." "Dad, focus on my voice," Clara said, using the calm, steady tone she reserved for her most agitated patients. "You're safe. The war is over. You're home with me and Ben." Slowly, awareness crept back into George's eyes. His breathing, which had been rapid and shallow, began to even out. He blinked several times, confusion replacing the terror on his face. "Clara?" His voice was rough, uncertain. "Yes, Dad. I'm here." She carefully sat on the edge of his bed, reaching for his hand. "It was cold and trembling. I was back there again, wasn't I?" Shame crept into his voice. "It's okay, Dad. It was just a nightmare." Clara squeezed his hand gently. A small movement caught her attention. Ben still stood in the doorway, his eyes wide with concern. Clara hadn't heard him follow her back. "Ben, honey, I told you to go to your room," she said, trying not to let her worry show in her voice. But Ben took a tentative step forward instead. "Grandpa, are you okay?" George quickly wiped his face with his free hand, trying to compose himself for his grandson. "I'm fine, buddy. Just a bad dream." Ben moved closer, his small face serious. "I get bad dreams too sometimes." Clara's heart clenched at his words. She hadn't known about this. "They're scary, aren't they?" Ben continued, now standing at the foot of George's bed. "But Mommy says angels watch over us when we sleep." George's grip on Clara's hand tightened slightly. "Your mommy told you that?" Ben nodded solemnly. "She says Daddy has an angel watching him in heaven, and that angel watches over me too." He paused, looking at his grandfather with those perceptive eyes that sometimes seemed too wise for his 10 years. "Maybe Daddy's angel can watch over you too, Grandpa." Clara felt her breath catch in her throat. She'd told Ben about his father's guardian angel years ago, when he'd first started asking questions about the dad he'd never known. She hadn't realized he'd held on to those words so carefully. George's face softened, the remaining tension draining from his shoulders. That's a nice thought, buddy." Ben moved around the bed, and without hesitation, gave his grandfather a hug. George stiffened for a moment before, awkwardly patting Ben's back with his free hand. "Mommy," Ben said, turning to Clara, "you're my daddy's angel too." The words hit Clara like a physical force, stealing her breath. She stared at her son, this child who somehow understood so much more than she'd realized. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she blinked them back. "I think it's time for bed, sweetheart," she managed to say. "Let's let Grandpa get some rest." George had settled back against his pillows, the worst of the episode past. "Good night, buddy," he said softly. "And thank you." Clara tucked the covers around her father, making sure he was comfortable before leading Ben out of the room. Her mind was spinning with the weight of what had just happened, with the realization that her son had been carrying his own fears and understanding in silence. She guided Ben back to his room, her hand gentle on his shoulder. As she helped him into bed and pulled his Superman covers up to his chin, she couldn't stop thinking about his words. Her daddy's angel. How long had he been processing all of this? How much had he been watching, understanding, worrying? The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows as Clara stood at the stove, flipping golden brown pancakes. The familiar sizzle of batter hitting the hot pan filled the quiet kitchen. She'd woken up early, hoping a warm breakfast might lift everyone's spirits after last night's events. George sat at the kitchen table, his coffee growing cold in front of him. His weathered hands wrapped around the mug, but his mind seemed far away. The newspaper lay untouched beside him. "Dad?" Clara called softly. "The pancakes are almost ready." George merely nodded, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the kitchen wall. Clara stacked 3 pancakes onto a plate, adding a pat of butter and a drizzle of maple syrup, just the way Ben liked them. "Ben," she called up the stairs. "Breakfast is ready, honey." Ben came down slowly, his small shoulders hunched forward. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, making him look older than his 10 years. He slid into his chair without his usual enthusiasm for pancakes. "Thanks, Mom," he mumbled, picking up his fork but not eating. Clara watched him with growing concern. The kitchen felt heavy with unspoken words, the only sound the quiet scraping of utensils against plates. She made herself busy, washing dishes at the sink, trying to ignore the knot forming in her stomach. "Mom?" Ben's voice was barely above a whisper. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" Clara dried her hands on a dish towel. "Of course, sweetie." Ben glanced at his grandfather, who remained lost in his own world, then took his mother's hand and led her into the living room. His small fingers felt cold in hers. "What's wrong, Ben?" Clara knelt down to his level, brushing his hair back from his forehead. "Is it—" Ben hesitated, biting his lower lip. "Is it normal to have nightmares like Grandpa?" Clara's heart squeezed tight in her chest. She forced a smile, even as alarm bells rang in her head. "Everyone has nightmares sometimes, honey. It's perfectly normal. But mine are different," Ben insisted, his voice trembling slightly. "They're scary, like Grandpa's. I hear him at night sometimes, and then I have bad dreams, too." Clara's practiced smile wavered. She wanted to pull him close, to promise him everything would be okay, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she patted his shoulder, falling back on her nurse's training to keep her voice steady and reassuring. "It's just your imagination, sweetheart. Try not to worry about it." But even as she said the words, she knew she was doing exactly what she shouldn't, brushing off his fears, just like she'd been doing with her own concerns about her father's deteriorating condition. Ben's shoulders slumped further, and he nodded without meeting her eyes. "Okay, Mom." The disappointment in his voice made Clara's chest ache. She watched as he trudged back to the kitchen, leaving his pancakes barely touched. The day passed in a blur of routine tasks and worried thoughts. Clara moved through the motions of caring for her father, making meals, checking his medications, but her mind kept returning to Ben's words. By evening, exhaustion had settled deep into her bones. George sat in his favorite armchair, struggling against sleep. His eyes would close, then snap open suddenly, his hands gripping the armrests. Clara knew the signs. He was fighting another nightmare, trying to stay awake to avoid the memories that haunted his dreams. She settled onto the arm of his chair, taking his rough hand in hers. His skin felt paper-thin beneath her fingers, but his grip was strong, almost desperate. "It's okay, Dad," she murmured. "I'm right here." George's eyes met hers for a brief moment, filled with a mixture of gratitude and shame that made her heart hurt. Then his gaze dropped away again, back to the battle he was fighting inside his mind. A small movement caught Clara's attention. Ben stood in the doorway in his pajamas, clutching his stuffed bear, the one he'd claimed he was too old for just months ago. His face was pale in the dim light. "Mom?" His voice quavered. "I'm scared to sleep by myself. Can I stay up with you and Grandpa?" George's hand tightened on hers as another tremor passed through him, but Ben's eyes pleaded with her from across the room. In that moment, the weight of her dual responsibilities crashed over her like a wave. She looked at her son, really looked at him, and saw what she'd been missing. The dark circles under his eyes had grown deeper. His shoulders curved inward protectively. He'd been carrying his own fears silently, while she'd been too focused on managing her father's crisis to notice. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She'd been so consumed with being George's caretaker that she'd failed to be the mother Ben needed. She'd dismissed his nightmares, ignored his growing anxiety, all while telling herself she was managing everything just fine. But she wasn't fine. None of them were. George's hand trembled in hers, and Ben still stood in the doorway, waiting for her response. Clara felt tears pressing behind her eyes, but she blinked them back. She couldn't break down now, not when they both needed her so much. But as she sat there, caught between her father's silent struggle and her son's unspoken need, Clara finally admitted to herself what she'd been denying for so long. She hadn't been there for Ben the way she should have been. She'd been so focused on keeping her father's demons at bay that she'd left her son to face his own fears alone. The truth of it settled heavy in her chest, a mixture of guilt and grief that threatened to overwhelm her. But acknowledging it was the first step toward change, if only she could figure out what that change needed to be. Clara's fingers traced the dusty cardboard boxes stacked in the corner of her father's room. The afternoon light cast long shadows across the floor as she knelt beside them, her knees protesting against the hard wooden boards. She hadn't meant to snoop, but worry had driven her here while George was dozing in his armchair downstairs. "There has to be something," she whispered to herself, carefully lifting the lid of the first box. The musty smell of old paper and forgotten memories wafted up. Inside, she found carefully folded uniforms, their olive green fabric faded with age. Her hands trembled as she lifted each item, treating them with the reverence they deserved. Beneath a stack of old photographs, her fingers brushed against something leather-bound. Clara pulled out a small, worn journal, its pages yellowed and corners dog-eared. The cover was scratched and weathered, bearing the unmistakable marks of having been carried through difficult conditions. 1968. She read the faint numbers scratched into the cover. Corner. Her heart squeezed in her chest. The year her father had served in Vietnam. Clara glanced toward the door, guilt gnawing at her conscience. She knew she shouldn't read it. These were her father's private thoughts. But the weight of his suffering, the nightly terrors, and Ben's growing fears pushed her forward. She needed to understand. The first few pages contained routine observations, weather reports, patrol schedules, and brief mentions of camp life. Her father's handwriting was neater then, more controlled. As she turned the pages, the writing became increasingly urgent, the ink sometimes smeared as if written in haste. Then she found it, an entry that made her breath catch. The 15th of July, 1968. They're gone. All of them. Murphy, Rodriguez, Thompson, my whole squad. I was supposed to lead them. I was responsible for bringing them home. Instead, I froze. When the ambush came, I couldn't move. I heard them calling for orders, but the words wouldn't come. 7 good men died because their sergeant couldn't do his job. Their families will get flags and letters saying their sons died, heroes. But I know the truth. They died because I failed them. Clara's hand flew to her mouth, tears blurring her vision. She'd never known this part of her father's story. He'd never spoken about his time in Vietnam beyond the most basic details. Now she understood the weight he'd been carrying all these years. The entries that followed were scattered, some pages torn or stained. Her father's normally neat handwriting had become almost frantic. Can't sleep. See their faces every time I close my eyes. The letters keep coming from their families, thanking me for serving with their sons, if they knew. Chaplain says it wasn't my fault. Says, combat paralysis happens to the best soldiers. But I was their leader. They trusted me. Started the paperwork for a discharge today. Can't lead men anymore. Not after what happened. Doctor says it's combat stress, but I know what it really is. Cowardice. Clara's tears fell onto the weathered pages. All these years, her father had been carrying this burden alone. The nightmares, the withdrawal, the anger, it all made sense now. He wasn't just dealing with the trauma of war, he was drowning in guilt. She carefully turned to the last entry, dated just before his return home. Coming home tomorrow. Everyone says I should be happy, but how can I be? 7 men won't ever see their families again because of me. Their mothers will never hug them again. Their children will grow up without fathers, and I have to live with that. God help me, I have to live with that. The journal ended there. Clara sat back against the wall, her father's pain washing over her in waves. She thought about all the time she'd pushed him to talk about his experiences, not understanding why he shut down. All the time she'd felt frustrated by his resistance to therapy or help of any kind. She gathered the journal and the scattered photos, carefully returning everything else to the box. As she descended the stairs, each step felt heavier than the last. George was still in his armchair, staring out the window at the setting sun. The journal felt like it weighed 100 pounds in her hands. Clara sank into the chair beside him. Her father's weathered hands rested on the arms of his chair, the same hands that had penned those haunting words decades ago. She placed the journal in her lap, its presence impossible to ignore. The ticking of the old wall clock filled the silence between them. Clara's throat felt tight. The words she wanted to say stuck somewhere between her heart and her lips. How could she even begin this conversation? How could she tell him she knew about the weight he'd been carrying alone all these years? She watched her father's profile, noting how the evening light softened the hard lines of his face. In that moment, she saw not just her father, but also the young sergeant who had faced an impossible situation and never forgiven himself for it. The man who had spent decades punishing himself for a moment of human frailty in the midst of unimaginable horror. Clara's fingers tightened around the journal, her knuckles white with tension. She wanted to reach out, to tell him it wasn't his fault, that he didn't have to carry this burden alone anymore. But the words wouldn't come. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths and decades of pain. Clara sat in her car outside the medical center, staring at the business card in her trembling hands. Dr. Sarah Matthews, family therapist. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dashboard as she traced the embossed letters with her fingertip. After discovering her father's journal, she knew she couldn't handle this alone anymore. She picked up her phone and dialed the number before she could change her mind. The receptionist's cheerful voice answered, and Clara found herself scheduling not one but 2 appointments, one for Ben and another for family therapy. "Would next Tuesday at 4 p.m. work for you and your son?" the receptionist asked. "Yes," Clara replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "That would be perfect." She ended the call and leaned back against the headrest, closing her eyes. The weight of guilt pressed against her chest. Was she failing them by asking for help? Shouldn't she be strong enough to handle this on her own? The hospital parking lot was already filling up as she made her way inside for her shift. The familiar antiseptic smell and fluorescent lights greeted her as she walked through the automatic doors. She changed into her scrubs mechanically, her mind still dwelling on the therapy appointments. "Clara!" Sarah, another nurse, burst into the break room. "We need you in ICU 3. Mr. Peterson's stats are dropping rapidly." In the past, Clara would have sprung into action immediately, her professional instincts taking over. But today, she felt rooted to the spot. The exhaustion of the past, weeks, months, years, seemed to crash over her all at once. Her legs felt like lead, and her brain struggled to process the urgency of the situation. "Clara?" Sarah's concerned voice broke through her fog. "Are you okay?" She shook her head, trying to clear it. "I'm coming," she managed, pushing herself up from the chair. But even as she followed Sarah to ICU 3, she felt like she was moving through molasses. The familiar routines that usually came naturally now required conscious effort. Throughout her shift, the feeling of being underwater persisted. She performed her duties adequately, but felt disconnected from everything around her. The discovery of her father's journal, the weight of Ben's nightmares, and now the decision to seek therapy, it all swirled in her mind like a relentless storm. When she finally arrived home that evening, the house was quiet except for the low murmur of the TV in the living room. George sat in his usual armchair, staring blankly at some game show. Ben was at the kitchen table, pushing his dinner around his plate. Clara took a deep breath. It was time to have that conversation with Ben first. She sat down next to him, noticing how his shoulders tensed slightly. "Hey, sweetheart," she said softly. "Can we talk for a minute?" Ben nodded, still focusing on his plate. "I've been thinking about your nightmares," she began, choosing her words carefully. "And I think it might help to talk to someone about them. Someone who's really good at helping kids with scary dreams." Ben's fork clattered against his plate. "Like a doctor?" "Sort of. But this doctor just talks with you. They help you understand your feelings and make the scary things less scary." Clara watched his face carefully, seeing the mix of fear and curiosity in his eyes. Will they make fun of me?" His voice was small, vulnerable. Clara's heart clenched. "No, honey, never," Dr. Matthews is very kind, and everything you tell her stays just between you two. It's like having a special friend who's really good at listening. Ben seemed to consider this, his forehead wrinkled in thought. Will you come with me? Of course. I'll be right there in the waiting room the whole time. She reached out and squeezed his hand. What do you think? Would you be willing to try it? After what felt like an eternity, Ben nodded slowly. Okay, Mom. I'll try. Clara pulled him into a tight hug, feeling some of the tension leave her body. One down, one to go. She found George still in his armchair, his eyes vacant. Taking another deep breath, she perched on the ottoman in front of him. Dad, she started, I think we need to talk about getting some help. George's expression hardened immediately. I don't need help. Dad, please. The nightmares are getting worse. There are people who specialize in helping veterans. I said no. His voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. I'm not going to sit there and tell some stranger about things they couldn't possibly understand. Clara felt the familiar mix of frustration and helplessness rising in her chest. They're trained professionals, Dad. They've helped other veterans. Other veterans haven't seen what I've seen. George's hands gripped the arms of his chair tightly. Haven't done what I've done. The journal's contents flashed through Clara's mind, but she kept her expression neutral. That's exactly why you need to talk to someone. These things you're carrying, they're too heavy to carry alone. The answer is no, Clara. George's tone left no room for argument. He turned back to the TV, effectively ending the conversation. Clara sat there for a moment longer, her throat tight with unshed tears. The victory of Ben's acceptance felt diminished by her father's stubborn refusal. But as she watched George retreat further into himself, she felt a new determination take root. She couldn't force him to get help, but she could make sure she and Ben got the support they needed. Maybe, just maybe, seeing their progress would eventually help George find his way toward healing too. The waiting room of Dr. Matthews' office felt smaller than Clara had imagined. Soft blue walls and comfortable chairs couldn't mask the anxiety that hung in the air. Ben sat beside her, his legs swinging back and forth, not quite reaching the floor. His fingers fidgeted with the worn edge of his favorite comic book. Bennett, a gentle voice called from the doorway. Doctor. Matthews smiled warmly, her silver-rimmed glasses catching the light. Come on in. Clara gave Ben's hand a reassuring squeeze as they followed the therapist into her office. The room was filled with natural light, and a shelf of toys and books lined one wall. Ben's eyes immediately went to a collection of action figures arranged on a low table. Would you like to play while we talk? Dr. Matthews asked Ben, who nodded shyly. As Ben settled on the carpet with a handful of superhero figures, Clara perched on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I'm worried about his nightmares, she began. They seem to be getting worse. Dr. Matthews nodded, her expression open and encouraging. Ben, can you tell me about these dreams? Ben paused, holding a Batman figure mid-flight. They're scary, he said quietly. Like Grandpa's. Clara's heart clenched. She hadn't realized Ben had made that connection. What makes them like Grandpa's? Dr. Matthews asked. Because Ben's voice trembled slightly. Because sometimes I hear him yelling at night, and Mom has to go help him, and then I get scared that the bad things he sees will come from me too. Clara fought back tears. She'd tried so hard to shield Ben from George's episodes, but children saw more than adults realized. Ben's been having trouble sleeping, Clara explained, her voice tight. He comes to check on me multiple times a night. I don't want Mom to be alone. Ben suddenly burst out. What if something happens to her? Like what happened to Grandpa's friends? The room fell silent. Clara stared at her son, shocked by the depth of his fears. She'd never known he worried about her safety. That must be very scary, Dr. Matthews said gently. It sounds like you're trying to be very brave for your mom. Ben nodded, his lower lip quivering. Sometimes Grandpa doesn't know where he is. He looks right through me like I'm not there. Mom says it's because he's remembering bad things, but he clutched the action figure tighter. What if one day he forgets us forever? Clara felt her carefully constructed composure cracking. She'd been so focused on managing the practical aspects of caring for George that she'd missed how deeply his condition was affecting Ben. "And Mom's always tired," Ben continued, his words tumbling out faster now. "She tries to smile, but I can tell she's sad. I want to help, but I don't know how." Dr. Matthews turned to Clara. "It sounds like Ben's carrying a lot of worry for such young shoulders." Clara nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She reached for Ben, who crawled into her lap, abandoning his toys. The session continued, revealing layer after layer of Ben's hidden fears. By the time they left, Clara felt emotionally raw, like she'd been turned inside out. In the car, Ben remained unusually quiet, staring out the window. Clara's phone buzzed, a text from their neighbor watching George. He was becoming agitated, refusing to eat lunch. "Ben, honey," Clara said softly, "I'm so sorry. I didn't know you were feeling all of this." Ben shrugged, still looking away. "It's okay, Mom. You have to take care of Grandpa." His mature response only made Clara's heart ache more. She pulled into their driveway, but didn't get out immediately. Instead, she reached for her phone again, scrolling to her mother's number. Maybe, just maybe, her mother could offer some guidance. The phone rang several times before her mother answered, sounding distracted. "Clara? Is everything all right?" "Mom, Clara's voice cracked. "I don't know what to do anymore. Ben's having nightmares. Dad's getting worse. And I feel like I'm failing them both." "Oh, sweetheart," her mother sighed. "You know I can't. I'm not in a good place myself right now. Maybe you should look into some kind of care facility for your father." Clara's hope deflated. Of course. Her mother had her own struggles, her own battles with depression that had kept her at arm's length for years. "Thanks anyway, Mom. I'll figure something out." Clara ended the call, feeling more alone than ever. Inside the house, they found George pacing the living room, his eyes distant and confused. Their neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, hovered anxiously nearby. "Dad?" Clara called out softly. "It's Clara and Ben. We're home now." George turned sharply, his expression vacant. "The coordinates are wrong," he muttered. "We need to move out before dark." Ben pressed closer to Clara's side, and she felt his small hand slip into hers. The weight of their morning revelations, her mother's inability to help, and George's current state crashed over her like a wave. For a moment, she couldn't breathe, couldn't think past the overwhelming pressure of it all. Mrs. Peterson touched her arm gently. "He's been like this for about an hour. I tried to get him to sit down, but—" Clara nodded mechanically, thanking their neighbor as she left. She guided Ben toward the kitchen, away from George's agitated pacing. But even as she tried to focus on making Ben a sandwich, she could hear her father's footsteps, his confused mumbling, the sound of her son's quiet sniffles. The morning's therapy session had stripped away her last defenses, leaving her raw and exposed. Ben needed her. George needed her. And she needed help she wasn't sure how to find. Clara's hands trembled as she tried to measure the correct dosage of medication for her patient. The numbers on the syringe blurred before her eyes, and she had to blink several times to bring them into focus. This was the third time she'd double-checked the measurement, something that used to come naturally to her after 15 years of nursing. "Bennett?" Sarah, her supervisor, touched her shoulder gently. "Everything okay?" Clara jumped, nearly dropping the syringe. "I'm fine," she said automatically, though her voice wavered, just being extra careful. Sarah's concerned frown told Clara she wasn't fooling anyone. "You've been standing here for 5 minutes. That's not like you." The fluorescent lights of the medicine room suddenly felt too bright, too harsh. Clara's scrubs clung to her body, damp with sweat. She'd barely slept 3 hours last night, after George's latest episode. The memory of his confused, terrified eyes haunted her through her shift. "I just need a minute," Clara insisted, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking. "Clara," Sarah's voice was firm but kind, "take a break. I'll cover for you. But my patients, We'll still be here in 15 minutes. Break room. Now. In the quiet of the break room, Clara slumped into a chair. Her phone buzzed. A text from Ben's teacher. Ben seemed distracted in class today. Is everything all right at home? The words swam before her eyes. Of course, Ben was distracted. How could he focus when his grandfather's screams woke him up almost every night? When his own nightmares kept him tossing and turning? When his mother was barely present, running on empty? Clara's vision blurred with unshed tears. She'd already made 2 medication errors this week, caught by her colleagues before they reached any patients, thankfully. But she knew she was slipping. The Clara Bennett who'd graduated top of her class, who'd earned Nurse of the Year 3 times, would never make such basic mistakes. The shift dragged on endlessly. By the time Clara pulled into her driveway that evening, her whole body ached. The porch light was on. She'd forgotten to turn it off again. This morning, another small task forgotten in the chaos of their morning routine. Inside, she found Mrs. Rodriguez, their elderly neighbor who sometimes watched George dozing in the armchair. George sat in front of the TV, staring blankly at a news program. Ben was nowhere to be seen. He's doing homework in his room, Mrs. Rodriguez said, gathering her things. George had a good day. Ate all his lunch. Clara nodded mechanically, fishing in her purse for Mrs. Rodriguez's payment. The woman hesitated before leaving, concern etched on her weathered face. Clara, dear, you don't look well. Perhaps you should. Thank you for today. Clara cut her off, forcing a smile. We really appreciate your help. Alone with George, Clara tried to engage him in conversation. Did you enjoy your day, Dad? He turned to her slowly, his eyes distant. Marie should be home soon. She's making pot roast tonight. Clara's heart clenched. Marie, her mother, had left years ago, unable to handle George's declining health. Dad, Mom's not, remember? It's just us now. Confusion clouded his features, followed by that terrible blank look she'd grown to dread. Right, he mumbled. Right. After a simple dinner of reheated lasagna, Clara practically crawled to her bedroom. She didn't even bother changing out of her scrubs, just collapsed onto the bed. Her muscles screamed in protest as she curled into a ball, pressing her face into the pillow to muffle her sobs. She must have dozed off, because the next thing she knew, screams pierced the quiet house. George's screams, raw and terrified, like he was back in the jungle, watching his friends die all over again. Clara stumbled out of bed, her heart pounding. But before she could reach George's room, she saw Ben already there, his small hand on his grandfather's arm. It's okay, Grandpa, Ben was saying, his voice trembling but determined. You're home. You're safe. George thrashed in his bed, his eyes wide but unseeing. They're coming! We have to move! Johnson, watch your 6! Dad! Clara called out, moving to his other side. Dad, you're having a nightmare! You're home in Massachusetts. You're safe. But tonight, nothing seemed to reach him. He continued to shout, lost in his memories, his face contorted in terror. Ben started crying, still holding onto his grandfather's arm. Mommy, make it stop, Ben pleaded. Please, make it stop. Clara tried everything, speaking softly, holding George's hand, turning on the lights, turning them off again. Nothing worked. She watched helplessly as her father relived his worst moments, as her son witnessed another piece of his childhood crumble away. The weight of it all, the sleepless nights, the medication errors, Ben's nightmares, George's deterioration, came crashing down on her. She couldn't do this anymore. Not alone. Not while watching her family fall apart piece by piece. Ben's small arms wrapped around her waist, his tears soaking into her scrubs. I'm scared, Mom. Clara held him close, her own tears falling freely now. The truth she'd been avoiding for months finally broke through her carefully constructed walls. She needed help. Real help, not just the occasional babysitting from Mrs. Rodriguez. She couldn't keep pretending she could handle everything on her own. The admission felt like both a defeat and a relief. Her pride had kept her going this long, but at what cost? Her father was getting worse. Her son was traumatized. and she was making dangerous mistakes at work. Something had to give. As George's shouts finally subsided into whimpers, Clara made a decision. Tomorrow, she would call the VA hospital about their PTSD program. She would look into family therapy for Ben. She would talk to Sarah about reducing her hours. The thought of admitting she couldn't cope made her cheeks burn with shame. But watching Ben try to comfort his grandfather while fighting back his own tears, that was a much higher price to pay. Clara stared at her phone, thumb hovering over Sarah Miller's contact. Sarah, her friend since nursing school, now worked as a care coordinator for a local senior center. After 3 deep breaths, Clara tapped call. Clara? It's been ages! Hi, Sarah. I need help. What's going on? It's Dad. I can't do this alone anymore. His PTSD is worsening. And Ben, Clara's voice broke. I've been wondering when you'd call. What do you need? Someone to help with Dad. A few hours daily. Someone who understands veterans. I know just the person. Janet's worked with veterans for 20 years. I'll set up a meeting. Relief flooded Clara. Thank you. Clara checked her watch, just enough time for Ben's emergency therapy appointment with Dr. Martinez. In the waiting room, Ben sat quietly, fidgeting with his jacket zipper. The boy, who once chattered about dinosaurs, now barely whispered. Ben Bennett? Doctor. Martinez appeared, smiling warmly. Inside, Ben settled into the oversized armchair, feet barely touching ground. Can you tell me about your dreams? Dr. Martinez asked gently. Ben glanced at Clara. They're about Grandpa. He's scared, and I can't help him. Clara's heart clenched. How does that make you feel? Scared too. Sometimes I think the bad things might come for me, and Mom will have to care for both of us. Clara reached for his hand, but Ben pulled away. I try being brave because Mom has enough worry, but when Grandpa screams at night, I hide under my blanket. That must be very hard. I miss how Grandpa used to be. He told stories about fishing and tree houses. Now he just stares out windows. Clara scheduled 3 more appointments. That evening, Clara found George by the living room window, streetlights highlighting his weathered face. Dad, we need to talk. She placed his Vietnam journal on the table. I found this. George's hands gripped his chair. That's private. I know. But we can't continue like this. Your nightmares aren't just affecting you, they're affecting Ben too. Surprise flickered across George's face. He's having nightmares, Dad. He's scared whatever haunts you might come for him. Clara's voice broke. We need to deal with this together. You don't understand what it was like. Then help me understand. Please, let me help carry this burden. After long silence, George reached for the journal with trembling hands. Tommy Martinez, just 19. Always talked about his mama's tamales. His fingers traced the worn cover. We were on patrol when... He swallowed hard. Clara took his hand. This time, he didn't pull away. I couldn't save him, George whispered, tears finally coming. I tried, but it wasn't your fault, Dad. George spoke haltingly about Tommy. The ambush. Decades of guilt. Clara held his hand tightly. When he fell silent, exhausted, Clara squeezed again. This is just the beginning. I've found a caregiver who specializes in veterans. George started protesting, but Clara continued. Please, if not for yourself, then for Ben. We need you back, the real you. After an eternity, George gave an almost imperceptible nod. Okay. Clara gripped the steering wheel outside Dr. Martinez's office. In the rearview mirror, Ben looked worried. George sat rigid beside her. We're here, Clara said softly. Just one session, Dad. George's shoulders tensed. Don't see the point of airing our dirty laundry to some stranger. Doctor. Martinez is really nice, Grandpa, Ben piped up. She has orange fish like Nemo. Clara caught George's expression soften slightly. Ben had been seeing Dr. Martinez for 2 weeks and was sleeping better. Inside, the waiting room's calming blues and greens featured comfortable chairs and Ben's mentioned fish tank bubbling quietly. Dr. Martinez, 50s with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair, welcomed them warmly. Ben has told me wonderful things about you both. Clara settled on the couch with Ben. George took the armchair nearest the door, keeping the plate. Exit in view, an old military habit. Let's start simply, Dr. Martinez suggested. Share one thing on your mind lately. Ben straightened. Can I go first? I've been thinking about nightmares, mine and Grandpa's. When I hear him at night, I get scared because he sounds so sad. Clara's heart clenched. She hadn't realized Ben was so aware. George gripped the armrests. You shouldn't hear that, boy. It's okay, Grandpa. Mom says it's because you saw scary things. I have scary dreams too, but mine are about you being sad and Mom being tired. Clara squeezed Ben's hand, tears pricking her eyes. George, what's on your mind? Doctor, Martinez asked. He stared at his hands. Just wish I wasn't such a burden. Dad, you're not. Clara started. What makes you feel like a burden? Doctor. Martinez interrupted gently. Long silence. Finally, his voice rough. Can't get through a night without waking everyone. Can't help Clara with Ben properly. But you help with my math homework, Ben interjected. And tell stories about model planes. Those are grandfather things. Surprise flickered across George's face. Clara, what's on your mind? Clara breathed deeply. I'm tired. Not just physically tired of pretending I can handle everything alone. I love you both, but sometimes I feel like I'm drowning. You don't have to keep us afloat, Mom, Ben said quietly. We can all learn to swim together. His words hung in the air. George blinked rapidly, his stoic expression cracking. Ben's right, Doctor, Martinez said. Healing isn't about one person carrying everyone. It's about supporting each other while struggling ourselves. They talked for 40 minutes. Ben shared fears and nightmares with amazing clarity, wanting to help but not knowing how. George mostly listened, watching Ben intently, managing only brief responses about war and loss when prompted. Clara opened up about constant worry and exhaustion. This is just a beginning, Dr. Martinez concluded. Healing takes time. What matters is taking this step together. Ben spontaneously hugged George before leaving. His grandfather's arms remained stiff, then slowly returned the embrace. His eyes met Clara's a tiny crack in his wall, a glimpse of the father from before nightmares took hold. During the ride home, Clara felt both lighter and heavier. The session revealed much Ben's understanding, George's shame, her need for support. Not a solution yet, but a start. Ben chatted about fish, while George stayed quiet, but this silence felt like reflection rather than withdrawal. Clara noticed his hand touching where Ben had hugged him, remembering. Clara stared at the kitchen calendar, studying the neat rows of appointments. 2 weeks had passed since their first family therapy session, and the routine was becoming familiar. Dr. Martinez saw Ben every Tuesday, while George had Thursday sessions. The weight hadn't disappeared, but sharing it made it manageable. Like carrying a heavy box, with help, same load, less strain. Morning. George's voice startled her. He stood in the doorway, dressed in his Thursday outfit. Ready for your session? Clara asked, pouring coffee. George settled at the table. Doctor, Martinez wants to talk about Saigon today. Clara's heart skipped. George voluntarily mentioning therapy was new. That must be difficult. Yeah, but Ben said scary things get less scary when you talk about them. Tears pricked Clara's eyes. He's smart. Gets it from his mother, George said quietly. I heard Ben laughing last night, George said suddenly. Real laughter. Clara nodded. He's sleeping better. The nightmares are less frequent. Because of therapy? And because he feels safer now that we're all getting help. George's expression tightened, then relaxed. Never thought I'd need a head doctor. Clara squeezed his hand. We all need help sometimes. Later, Clara picked up Ben from school. He chatted animatedly, his voice lighter than in months. I told Jimmy about my nightmares. Ben bounced in his seat. He said he gets scared sometimes, too. That was brave, Clara said. Doctor. Martinez says being brave means doing something even when you're scared. They pulled into the driveway. George sat on the front porch, something he hadn't done in years. Ben ran to show him a drawing while Clara watched from the car. That evening, Clara found George still on the porch. She settled beside him with an Afghan. Nice night, she said softly. George nodded. Used to love nights like this in Vietnam. When it was quiet, you could almost forget where you were. He paused. Almost. There was this young soldier, Joey Martinez, just a kid, always talking about his mama's cooking. George's voice, barely whispered. One night, during patrol, I was supposed to watch his six, but I got distracted, just for a second. His hand shook. 1 second was all it took. Dad, Clara whispered, all these years, I've carried that moment. Every time I close my eyes, I see Joey's face. If I'd just been paying attention. Tears rolled down George's cheeks. Clara squeezed his hand. I never told anyone. How do you tell someone you failed at the one thing you were supposed to do? Clara rested her head against his shoulder. You didn't fail. You were human. So young yourself. I see him in dreams. Sometimes Ben's face instead of Joey's, and I wake up terrified I'll fail him too. Is that why you've been afraid to get close to Ben? George nodded. How can I be a proper grandfather when I couldn't protect Joey? Clara took his hands. What happened was tragic, but it doesn't define you. Ben adores you, even through the hard times. They sat listening to crickets and distant traffic. Dr. Martinez says I need to forgive myself, George said finally. Says I've punished myself long enough. She's right. Joey wouldn't want you carrying this pain forever. George squeezed her hand. When did you get so wise? Must be all those therapy sessions rubbing off. Clara watched George across the breakfast table, noting how his hands trembled less these days when he held his coffee cup. The morning light streamed through the kitchen window, casting a warm glow on his weathered face. 2 weeks of therapy had brought small changes. A few more words at dinner, the occasional smile when Ben told jokes. Your appointment's at 10 today, Dad, Clara reminded him gently, sliding a plate of scrambled eggs in front of him. Doctor, Martinez said you're making good progress. George's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Progress was there, even if it came in baby steps. Ben bounded into the kitchen, backpack slung over one shoulder. Morning, Mom. Morning, Grandpa. His cheerfulness filled the room like sunshine. Someone's in a good mood, Clara said, ruffling his hair as she passed him his breakfast. Miss Thompson said I can do my history presentation on Vietnam, Ben announced proudly. I thought maybe Grandpa could help. The coffee cup crashed to the floor. George's face had gone pale, his eyes distant and unfocused. Clara recognized the signs immediately. The rapid breathing, the rigid posture. Ben, honey, go wait in the living room, Clara said quickly, but it was too late. You don't know! George's voice rose sharply. None of you know what it was like. His hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. Clara approached slowly, keeping her voice calm. Dad, you're right. We don't know. But we're trying to understand. Understand? George pushed back from the table, chair scraping against the floor. How can you understand? You push and push, thinking your little therapy sessions will fix everything. His voice cracked with emotion. You're just like your mother, always thinking you know what's best. The words hit Clara like a physical blow. She saw Ben freeze in the doorway, his eyes wide with fear. Dad, please, Clara tried again, reaching for his arm. Let's just... No, George jerked away. You think you're helping? You're making it worse. Every time I have to talk about it. Every time I have to remember. His voice broke. You don't understand what it's like to see their faces every night, to hear their screams. Tears welled in Clara's eyes. Then help me understand, she pleaded. Please, Dad. But George was lost in his memories now, pacing the kitchen like a caged animal. The jungle. So much blood. Tommy was just a kid, just like Ben. His words dissolved into ragged breathing. Ben took a step forward. Grandpa? Ben! No! Clara moved to block his path, but George had already noticed him. Get out! George shouted, his face contorted with anguish. Both of you, just get out! Clara grabbed Ben's hand and pulled him from the kitchen. She heard something else crash behind them. Another cup, maybe a plate. Ben was trembling. Go to your room, sweetheart, she whispered, trying to keep her voice steady. Lock the door. I'll come get you when it's safe. Ben hesitated. But Mom, please, baby. Go. She waited until she heard his bedroom door close before sliding down the wall in the hallway, her legs giving out beneath her. The sound of George's harsh breathing and muttered words drifted from the kitchen. All their progress, all their careful steps forward, had it meant nothing? Hours later, after George had finally calmed down and retreated to his room, Clara sat on the edge of Ben's bed. The evening shadows stretched across his bedroom floor, and she could hear the distant sound of crickets beginning their nightly chorus. "I'm so sorry, Ben," she whispered, her throat tight with unshed tears. "I thought we were doing better." "I thought." She trailed off, unable to finish. Ben scooted closer, leaning his head against her arm. "I know you're trying, Mom," he said softly. "I'm trying too." Clara wrapped her arm around him, pulling him close. His simple words pierced straight through her heart, reminding her that even in their darkest moments, there was still light to be found. "When did you get so wise?" she asked, managing a watery smile. "Miss Thompson says we're all works in progress," Ben replied, his voice serious. "Like my art projects. Sometimes you mess up and have to start over, but that doesn't mean you give up." Clara closed her eyes, letting his words sink in. They were all works in progress. George with his demons, Ben with his understanding, and herself with her expectations. Maybe that was okay. Maybe the setbacks weren't failures, but just part of their journey together. "Can we make hot chocolate?" Ben asked, breaking into her thoughts. "With extra marshmallows?" Clara laughed softly, wiping her eyes. "Extra marshmallows sound perfect right now." As they headed to the kitchen, carefully stepping around the broken cups that still needed to be cleaned up, Clara held on to Ben's words like a lifeline. They were trying, all of them, in their own ways. Sometimes that had to be enough. The spring breeze rustled through the trees as Clara guided George along the worn path in Peterson Park. She matched his slow, careful steps, noticing how the sunlight caught the silver in his hair. The morning was quiet except for birdsong and the distant laughter of children at the playground. "Want to rest for a minute?" Clara asked, gesturing to a wooden bench overlooking the duck pond. George nodded, lowering himself with a soft grunt. Clara sat beside him, giving him space but staying close enough to offer support if needed. A family of ducks paddled across the water, the tiny ducklings following their mother in a perfect line. "Reminds me of my unit," George said softly, watching the ducks, following orders, staying in formation. Clara's heart skipped a beat. Her father rarely spoke about his military service without prompting. She remained quiet, afraid that saying the wrong thing might make him retreat back into silence. "We were just kids," he continued, his voice rough with emotion. "Barely older than Ben is now when we signed up. Thought we were invincible." He clasped his hands together, knuckles white. "Bobby Martinez was 19 when—" His voice cracked. Clara placed her hand gently on his arm. "It's okay, Dad. You don't have to—" "No." George interrupted, taking a deep breath. "I need to say this. Been carrying it too long." He looked down at his hands, weathered and lined with age. "Bobby was my best friend in the unit, always cracking jokes, sending letters to his mama back home. That last night he took my watch shift because I wasn't feeling well. A jogger passed by, and George waited until the footsteps faded before continuing. The attack came during his shift. If I'd been there instead." He shook his head, blinking rapidly. "All these years I've been carrying that guilt, thinking it should have been me." Clara felt tears welling up in her eyes. "Dad, it wasn't your fault. You couldn't have known." "In my head, I know that," George said. "But my heart—" He pressed a hand to his chest. "The nightmares, they're always the same. I hear the explosions, the screaming. I see Bobby's face, so young, so scared, and I can't save him. I can never save him." A duck quacked loudly, making them both jump. George managed a weak smile, patting Clara's hand. "Sorry, I've been such a burden, sweetheart. You and Ben, you deserve better than a broken old soldier." "Don't say that," Clara said firmly. "You're not broken, Dad. You're healing." "And we're healing together." She squeezed his hand. Ben loves you so much. He's so proud of his grandpa, the veteran who served his country. George's eyes misted over. That boy. He reminds me of Bobby sometimes. Same kind heart. He straightened his shoulders. Maybe that's why it's been so hard. Seeing Ben, knowing Bobby never got to grow up, have kids of his own. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the ducks swim lazy circles in the pond. A cool breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers, and Clara felt something shift between them, like a heavy curtain being drawn back to let in light. I'm ready to really try now, George said suddenly. The therapy, the medication, all of it. Not just for me, but for you and Ben. He turned to look at Clara, his eyes clear and determined. Bobby would have wanted me to live, wouldn't he? Really live, not just survive. Clara nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She wrapped her arms around her father, feeling his tears dampen her shoulder. They held each other as the morning sun warmed their faces, sharing a moment of healing that had been decades in the making. Later that night, Clara stood in Ben's doorway, watching her son sleep peacefully. His chest rose and fell in steady rhythm, no sign of the nightmares that had plagued him for so long. His favorite stuffed bear was tucked under one arm, and a small smile played on his lips. She tiptoed to his bedside, gently brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. The worry lines that had started to appear on his young face were smoothed away in sleep, making him look like the carefree child he should be. From down the hall, she could hear the soft sounds of George's television, not because he was avoiding sleep, but because he was watching his favorite old Western movie. Earlier, he'd even laughed at dinner, really laughed, when Ben told a silly joke from school. Clara sank into the rocking chair beside Ben's bed, feeling the day's emotions wash over her. The morning's conversation in the park had unlocked something in George, some tightly sealed door that had kept his pain locked away for decades. Now that it was open, healing could finally begin. She closed her eyes, listening to Ben's steady breathing and the distant murmur of the television. For the first time in years, their home felt peaceful, like a place where hearts could mend and nightmares could fade. There would still be hard days ahead, she knew, but they would face them together, stronger for having faced their fears and spoken their truths. The moonlight filtered through Ben's window, casting soft shadows on the wall. Clara felt her own tension melting away, replaced by a quiet hope that had been missing for so long. They were going to be okay, all of them. One day at a time, one moment of honesty at a time, they would find their way back to joy. The emergency room buzzed with its usual chaos, but today felt different. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she checked the vitals of Mr. Rodriguez, a grandfather of 4 who had suffered a severe heart attack. His condition was critical, and she knew he needed constant monitoring. Nurse Bennett, doctor. Thompson called from across the room. We need you in Trauma 3. Clara glanced at her watch. It was only 2 in the afternoon, and her shift wasn't supposed to end until 8. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, another text from the caregiver she'd hired for George. He was having one of his difficult days. I'll be right there, she replied, but her heart wasn't in it. Images of George and Ben floated through her mind, making it hard to focus. In Trauma 3, a young woman lay unconscious, her vital signs unstable. Clara moved automatically, setting up IV lines and assisting Dr. Thompson, but her thoughts kept drifting home. The caregiver's text had mentioned George was refusing to eat lunch and becoming increasingly agitated. Clara? Dr. Thompson's voice cut through her distraction. Are you with us? She nodded, forcing herself to concentrate. But as she reached for a fresh bag of saline, her hands shook again. The weight of her divided attention pressed down on her shoulders like a heavy blanket. I'm sorry, she whispered, stepping back from the bed. I can't. I need to. Dr. Thompson studied her face for a moment, understanding dawning in his eyes. He'd known Clara for years, knew about her situation at home. Go, he said quietly. Martinez can cover for you. Family comes first. Tears pricked at Clara's eyes. But Mr. Rodriguez, we've got it covered, he assured her. You're no good to anyone if you're stretched too thin. Clara nodded gratefully, her throat tight with emotion. She quickly changed out of her scrubs in the locker room, her movements rushed but purposeful. As she gathered her things, she caught her reflection in the small mirror on her locker door. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, but there was something else there too: determination. The drive home felt both endless and too quick. Clara's mind raced with worry about leaving work early, but her heart pulled her toward home with an undeniable force. She turned onto her street, noticing how the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pavement. As she pulled into her driveway, something made her pause. The sound of laughter, Ben's bright, childish giggle, drifted from the backyard. Clara's breath caught in her throat. It had been so long since she'd heard that sound. She walked around the side of the house, her nursing shoes crunching quietly on the gravel path. The sight that greeted her made her stop in her tracks. In the small vegetable garden they'd started last summer, George was kneeling beside a row of tomato plants, his weathered hands showing Ben how to stake the growing vines. The caregiver sat nearby in a lawn chair, watching with a gentle smile. "No, Grandpa, like this," Ben was saying, carefully wrapping a piece of twine around one of the stakes. His small fingers worked with surprising confidence. George nodded approvingly. "That's right, buddy. Just like I showed you." Clara watched, transfixed, as her father, the same man who had been lost in his traumatic memories just that morning, patiently guided Ben's hands through the gardening task. There was no trace of the confusion or agitation the caregiver had texted about. Instead, George's face held a peace she hadn't seen in years. Ben looked up then, spotting her. "Mom, you're home early." He jumped up, brushing dirt from his knees. "Look what Grandpa's teaching me. We're helping the tomatoes grow tall." George turned at Ben's exclamation, and Clara saw something shift in his expression, a softening around his eyes, a slight lift at the corners of his mouth. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close. "The boy's got a natural green thumb," George said, his voice gruff but warm. "Takes after his grandmother." Clara's heart swelled at the mention of her mother. George rarely spoke of her these days. She walked closer, taking in the neat row of staked plants, the fresh soil under their fingernails, the shared concentration on their faces. "This is wonderful," she said, "meaning so much more than just the garden work. You two make quite a team." Ben beamed with pride. "Grandpa says we might get tomatoes by August if we take good care of them. Can we make your special sauce when they're ready?" "Of course we can," Clara replied, watching as George slowly got to his feet, his movements stiff but purposeful. The caregiver moved to help him, but George waved her off gently, managing on his own. "Sarah here's been a big help," George said, nodding toward the caregiver. "She suggested the gardening might be good for my mind." He cleared his throat, looking down at his dirt-covered hands. Clara turned to Sarah with grateful eyes. The caregiver smiled back, understanding passing between them. Sometimes healing came in unexpected ways, through tiny tomato plants and dirty hands and shared moments in the afternoon sun. Ben tugged at Clara's sleeve. "Can we water them now?" "Grandpa says it's important to water them the same time every day. Why don't you show me how?" Clara said, following her son to the garden hose. As she watched Ben carefully direct the spray of water, with George offering quiet guidance from beside them, Clara felt something shift inside her chest. The guilt about leaving work early faded, replaced by a certainty that she was exactly where she needed to be. They weren't perfect. George would still have his bad days, Ben would still need time to process his feelings, and Clara would still struggle to balance it all. But here, in this moment, with the sun warming their shoulders and the promise of homegrown tomatoes ahead, they were healing. Not just individually, but together, growing stronger like the carefully staked plants in their garden. The afternoon light turned golden, casting a warm glow over their small family tableau. Clara took a deep breath, letting the peace of the moment wash over her. Sometimes the biggest breakthroughs came not in dramatic moments, but in quiet afternoons spent in the garden, learning to grow together. The waiting room of Dr. Marshall's office felt different today. Clara sat next to George, noticing how his shoulders seemed less tense than they had been months ago. Sunlight streamed through the window, casting a warm glow on the pale blue walls. Pictures of serene landscapes hung in simple wooden frames, creating a peaceful atmosphere that had become familiar over their weeks of therapy. "Are you ready, Dad?" Clara asked softly, watching George's hands fidget with his worn baseball cap. He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "As ready as I'll ever be, sweetheart. Doctor." Marshall welcomed them into her office, her kind eyes crinkling at the corners as she smiled. The room smelled faintly of lavender, and the comfortable leather chairs creaked as they settled in. "So, this is our final session together, Doctor," Marshall began, her voice gentle but confident. "How are you both feeling about that?" Clara glanced at her father, surprised when he spoke first. "Better than I thought I would," George said, his voice steadier than it had been in years. "These sessions, they've helped me understand things I've been running from for decades." Clara felt tears prick at her eyes. It was the most open she'd heard him be about his feelings in years. "Clara," Dr. Marshall prompted, "how about you?" She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "I feel like I'm finally getting to know my dad again, not just as the person who needs my help, but as someone who's been carrying so much pain for so long." George reached over and took her hand, something that would have been unthinkable just months ago. His grip was firm but gentle, conveying years of unspoken emotion. "I want to tell you something, Clara," George said, his voice thick with emotion. "Something I should have said a long time ago." He paused, collecting himself. "I'm sorry for all the years I shut you out, for making you carry the weight of my struggles alone." Clara squeezed his hand, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "Dad, let me finish," he said softly. "You've been my angel, just like Ben said. But I realize now that wasn't fair to you. You needed your father, not just someone to take care of." "Doctor," Marshall leaned forward slightly. "George, that's a powerful acknowledgement. Clara, how does that make you feel?" Clara wiped her eyes with her free hand. "It means everything," she whispered. "For so long I thought I was doing something wrong, that I wasn't helping enough or doing enough." "You did more than enough," George insisted. "The war, it took so much from me, but I let it take even more by pushing away the people who loved me most." Dr. Marshall nodded encouragingly. "George, you've made remarkable progress in facing your trauma. Clara, you've learned to set boundaries while maintaining your compassion. How do you both see your relationship moving forward?" George straightened in his chair. "I want to be there for my daughter and grandson. Really be there. The nightmares, they still come, but now I know I don't have to face them alone." Clara felt something shift inside her chest, like a weight she'd carried for years was finally lifting. "And I know now that being there for you doesn't mean I have to solve everything. We can face this together, as a family." Dr. Marshall smiled warmly. "That's exactly what healing looks like. It's not about erasing the past or pretending the pain doesn't exist. It's about learning to carry it together, supporting each other through the difficult moments." As they wrapped up the session, Dr. Marshall reminded them that they could always return if they needed support. Standing in the parking lot afterward, Clara turned to her father. "How about we have dinner together tonight? All three of us?" she suggested. "Like we used to?" George's eyes brightened. "I'd like that very much." That evening, Clara set the table with care, using the good plates they usually saved for special occasions. The aroma of pot roast, George's favorite, filled the house. Ben helped arrange the silverware, humming quietly to himself. "Smells good in here," George said as he entered the dining room, freshly showered and wearing a clean button-down shirt. "Ben helped me cook," Clara said, watching her son beam with pride. They settled around the table, the familiar routine feeling new somehow. George said grace, his voice clear and steady. Clara passed the potatoes to Ben, who served himself a generous portion. The simple act of sharing a meal together felt profound. Looking around the table, Clara took in the sight of her family. Ben was telling George about his science project, gesturing enthusiastically with his fork. George listened intently, asking questions and offering encouraging words. The tension that had once filled their home had been replaced by something softer, warmer. This was what healing looked like, Clara realized. Not perfect, not without its challenges, but real and honest and alive. They were learning to be a family again, one day at a time. "More carrots, Dad?" she offered, holding out the bowl. George smiled, reaching for it. "Thanks, sweetheart." And not just for the carrots. Ben looked between them, his young face wise beyond his years. "Can we do this more often? Having dinner together?" "I think that's a wonderful idea," Clara replied, her heart full as she watched her father nod in agreement. The evening light filtered through the windows, casting a golden glow over their simple family meal. Clara felt tears threatening again, but these were different from the ones she'd shed in therapy. These were tears of gratitude, of hope, of understanding that healing wasn't a destination they needed to reach, but a journey they would continue to share together. Clara stood in her kitchen, stirring a pot of homemade chicken soup, Ben's favorite. The familiar aroma filled their small home, mixing with the scent of fresh bread from the nearby bakery. Through the kitchen window, she could see George sitting on the back porch, peacefully reading a book. The sight made her pause, spoon still in hand. Just 6 months ago, such a peaceful evening would have seemed impossible. Now, the simple act of her father reading outside, without anxiety or confusion clouding his features, felt like a small miracle. "Mom, can I help?" Ben's voice pulled her from her thoughts. He stood in the doorway, homework papers clutched in his hand. "Of course, sweetie. Want to set the table?" Ben nodded eagerly, carefully placing his schoolwork on the counter before reaching for the plates. Clara watched as he meticulously arranged 3 place settings, making sure each fork lined up perfectly. The careful attention he gave to such a simple task reminded her of how much he'd grown. "I got an A on my science project," Ben announced, placing the last spoon. "Miss Thompson said my presentation about stars was the best in class." Clara's heart swelled with pride. Just months ago, Ben had been too anxious to speak in front of his classmates. Now here he was, excelling in presentations. "That's wonderful, honey. We should celebrate. Maybe Grandpa can tell us more about the constellations after dinner?" Ben's eyes lit up with hope. He promised he would. Clara nodded, remembering how George had recently started sharing stories about happier times, like teaching astronomy to his fellow soldiers during peaceful nights in the field. Those memories no longer seemed to trigger his PTSD as they once had. "Let me get him for dinner," Clara said, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She stepped onto the back porch, where the evening air carried the sweet scent of blooming jasmine. "Dad, soup's ready." George looked up from his book, his eyes clear and present. "Smells wonderful, Clara." He marked his page carefully and stood, his movements steady. "Ben helping you?" "He set the table perfectly," Clara replied, offering her arm out of habit, though George rarely needed the support anymore. They gathered around the kitchen table, steam rising from 3 bowls of soup. Ben chatted excitedly about his science project, while George listened intently, asking thoughtful questions. Clara found herself taking small bites, savoring not just the food, but the moment. "Remember when you taught me about Orion's belt, Grandpa?" Ben asked between spoonfuls. "Can we look at the stars tonight?" George's face brightened. "Weather's perfect for it. We might even see Mars." Clara watched their exchange, remembering countless nights when George had been lost in his own dark memories, unable to connect with his grandson. Now, their shared interest in astronomy had become a bridge between them, helping both heal in unexpected ways. After dinner, they moved to the living room. Ben curled up next to Clara on the couch, while George settled into his favorite armchair. The evening news played softly in the background, but none of them really watched it. Instead, they shared stories about their day, Ben's triumph at school, George's progress with his new medication, Clara's successful handling of a difficult case at work. "I had my first full week without nightmares," Ben announced suddenly, his voice quiet but proud. Clara pulled him closer, kissing the top of his head. She caught George's eye across the room, seeing her own emotions reflected there: pride, relief, and lingering hints of guilt for the trauma they'd all endured. "That's wonderful, sport," George said, his voice gruff with emotion. You're stronger than I was at your age. We're all strong, Clara interjected gently. And we're stronger together. The words hung in the air, simple but profound. Clara thought about all the time she'd tried to carry their burdens alone, thinking it was her responsibility to fix everything. Now she understood that healing happened when they supported each other, when they weren't afraid to lean on one another. As the evening grew later, Ben started yawning. "Time for bed, sweetheart," Clara said, standing up. "We can look at the stars tomorrow night. Promise?" Ben asked, looking between his mother and grandfather. "Promise," they answered in unison, causing all three to laugh. George stood and gave Ben a warm hug. "Sleep well, grandson. I'm proud of you." Clara led Ben upstairs to his room, helping him into his pajamas and watching as he went through his bedtime routine. The nightlight in the corner cast a soft glow, but Ben no longer needed it to feel safe. He climbed into bed, snuggling under his favorite blue comforter. As Clara sat on the edge of his bed, Ben looked up at her with eyes wise beyond his years. "Mom, we're going to be okay." Clara felt tears well up in her eyes as she smiled back at her son, knowing that, finally, they were. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below, and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you enjoyed the story of George Bennett, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.